Sadiq Khan is taking back control. Rent control? Rent control is among the best understood issues in all of economics, and, among economists anyway, one of the least controversial. Do you know who said that? Paul Krugman said that. That's right, folks. Economists from all over the political spectrum, left and right, have understood for decades that rent controls do not have their desired effects. The artificially low price of rent pushes up demand because now more people think they can afford to live there. In fact, all you've done in real terms is to change the method of rationing living spaces. As Milton, Friedman and George Stigler put it back in 1947, you've changed it from a price rationing system to rationing based on chance and favoritism. Hey, maybe if you're lucky enough to know the mayor personally, he can pull a few strings, huh? Rent controls also reduce supply because they reduce value. Toronto, for example, imposed rent controls in 1975 and affected building values fell by 40% over 5 years. As a result, constructors and developers no longer think their projects are financially viable and therefore switch either to building uber luxury housing or to commercial properties. And so the net effect almost immediately is to create a shortage in housing. In Melbourne, Australia, after World War II, not a single new apartment was built in 9 years of rent control. After rent control was instituted in Santa Monica, California in 1979, building permits declined to less than 1/10 of what they were just 5 years earlier. A housing study in San Francisco in 2001 found that 3/4 of its rent-controlled housing was more than half a century old, and 44% of it was more than 70 years old. Under rent control in England and Wales, privately built rental housing fell from being 61% of all housing in 1947 to being just 14% by 1977. During 8 years of rent control in Washington, D.C. during the 1970s, that city's available rental housing stock declined absolutely from just over 199,000 units on the market to just under 176,000 units. After rent control was introduced in Berkeley, California, the number of private rental housing units available to students at the university there declined by 31% in 5 years. Within 3 years after rent control was imposed in Toronto in 1976, 23% of all rental units in owner-occupied dwellings were withdrawn from the housing market. On top of that, the behavior of renters changes so that you get people occupying larger spaces than they need to for a longer period. In San Francisco in 2001, a study showed that 49% of that city's rent-controlled apartments had only a single occupant, while a severe housing shortage in the city had thousands of people living considerable distances away and making long commutes to their jobs in San Francisco. Meanwhile, a census report showed that 48% of all households in Manhattan, where most apartments were under some form of rent control, are occupied by only one person. New York City has had rent control for longer and more stringently than any other major American city. One consequence has been that the annual rate of turnover of apartments in New York is less than half the national average, and the proportion of tenants who lived in the same apartment for 20 years or more is more than double the national average. As the New York Times summarized the situation, New York used to be like other cities, a place where tenants moved frequently and landlords competed in rent empty apartments to newcomers. But today, the motto may as well be, no immigrants need apply. While immigrants are crowded into bunks in illegal boarding houses in the slums, upper middle class locals pay low rents to live in good neighborhoods often in large apartments they no longer need after their children move out. Meanwhile, the behaviour of landlords also changes with rent controls because the incentives have been removed for them to maintain their properties as they might have. So the actual living spaces deteriorate and in some cases are even abandoned. It has been estimated that there are at least 4 times as many abandoned housing units in New York City as there are homeless people living on the streets there. Of course, Sadiq Khan, he knows all this, but he has to tell all those people who are almost certainly going to elect him again next year that he's done something in his time as mayor, doesn't he? And naturally, they'll gobble it up and he will be mayor again. Now get out.